darkness. Heavenly Father, we thank you so much for all the blessings that we receive day by day, even if we don't even notice things that we're not worthy to receive, but you're willing and loving to give. Help us today to see more of your great creation, that we may worship you in spirit and truth. In Yeshua's name, amen. So how old is that rock anyway? Not used to this clicker. It says on. She checked it. It's not moving. Okay. Well, the last session, what we looked at a couple of timelines. We looked at evolution that had a timeline of 20 billion years, and we looked at creation with a timeline of 6,000 years. Clearly, they're different. But we also saw some Bible theories where they tried to inject time into the Bible. Now, that does great violence to the Bible, and we saw some problems with those theories. Then we started to look at what true science is, that it's observable, repeatable, and refutable, and how evolution is not science because it doesn't follow those things. We also looked at some kind of a whirlwind of some major proof areas, and we destroyed evolution 4 times. Knowing this first, that scoffers will come in the last days. Well, we have those. Walking according to their own lusts. I guess the 3 angels' message with the judgment hour message hasn't caught up with them yet. Saying, where is the promise of his coming? For since the fathers fell asleep, all things continue as they were from the beginning of creation. So this all things continuing from creation is called the doctrine of uniformity. The idea that lots of slow, small processes over long periods of time, and that's what evolution uses. Before a few hundred years ago, everybody believed in the flood. They believed in a catastrophism, that there was this big flood that happened in the past. Now, to look at this topic of long periods of time and a short catastrophe, we're going to have to look at some things like fossils. So let's take a quick look at some fossils. Here we have some different types of fossils. We have impressions. So like a footprint is an impression fossil. The creature's not there, you just see the impression. We have mineral replaced fossils. In the mineral replaced fossils, all the parts of the creature have been erased, but other minerals have filled in and replaced the original creature. So we have an outline, kind of a diagram of what the creature used to be shaped like. Now, depending on how fossilized it is, some are partially fossilized, some are completely fossilized. And the third kind really doesn't matter. You can kind of think of it as a stain. Anyway, one of the theories about how rock layers are formed is the theory of superposition. Now, basically what this means is any layers on the top are younger, and any layers down lower are the oldest. And so down very low is the very oldest, and the mediums, length of time is the next ones. But we've done some scientific research on how layers are formed, and we find in some ways they are formed horizontally and not vertically. So we have a situation where the fossil is formed. Let me see if my little animation's going to run. Come on, do something. It didn't run. Anyway, it would show you the material building up. Basically what happens is the upper left and the lower right are being formed at the same time, and it goes across and forms that way. And we're going to see an actual example of that has happened fairly recently. Now, we've looked at the deposits around the planet. We've dug just about everywhere. That's what humans do. I know they dig. Anyway, we found one single deposit, and these are basically water deposited deposit that covered practically the entire United States, actually up into Canada some too. Now, a deposit like that cannot be deposited by a local flood, like Houston. This is actually evidence of a global deposit. I don't know, it kind of sounds like a flood. So we do find different layers, and in the different layers there is sort of generally some different types of critters being found in the different layers. Now I want to talk a little bit about why critters of different types might be distributed a certain way. Okay? First of all, the size of the critter would have something to do with which layer it's going to be at. Larger would tend to be a little higher up in the layers. Density would matter. So for instance, if you have a dense reptile and a very light bird, when it deposited, the bird would tend to be more higher up in the layers, just because of its weight, of its density. Mobility. If you were like the old hare and the rabbit, hare and the turtle, tortoise and the rabbit, tortoise and the hare. We'll get there. So the tortoise, he can't move very fast, so if something bad is coming, the tortoise is going to get covered first, and the rabbit might get a little further. Now, also intelligence has something to do with it. If you're a little more intelligent, you might observe something bad coming and be able to try to flee. And we actually have some evidence of fleeing animals, wounded even, fleeing dinosaurs. We'll look at that later. And then the habitat you started in. If you started in a lagoon, when things went bad, you would get buried first. If you were up in a mountain like an eagle, you would tend to be buried later. I mean, so just by where you are would matter. Now, in textbooks, a lot of times you'll see a picture like this, and they'll talk about the geologic column. And you could see there is roughly the separation that we were just talking about. And they have different creatures at different levels, and they'll say that the very bottom was very, very, very old, and then the very top is very recent. Now, this column that you see in this diagram, it exists really only in one place in the world, with all the creatures laid out in the order they say, with the layers in the order they say, and in a complete with all the layers there. And it only exists one place in the world, and that is in your textbook. So we have to look a little bit at the whole business of how did these fossils that we find, how did they get formed in the first place? Because if you understand a little bit of how fossils are formed, you might have some idea if one of these two theories is more accurate. Well, I looked in a textbook, and I saw this picture. I thought, gee, that's an interesting picture. This picture is trying to tell us how a fossil is formed. And they show a dinosaur tumbling off a cliff. I thought that was kind of unusual, but if you understand how fossils are made, you understand that there's really two factors, or maybe three factors that are needed for a fossil. You need to have water, you need to have rapid burial, and you need a little bit of time. So they're throwing him off the cliff to get him in water. They got to get him in water. Flood. All right. So I was looking at this dinosaur falling off the cliff, and I was considering, what is his motivation? What is he thinking? And I thought, maybe he was jilted. And he jumped off the cliff. I don't know. The next picture they had is they had him buried under the water. Now, I thought it was kind of humorous that they had the water really still, because they didn't want you thinking about a flood. But they covered him. You know, he fell off the cliff into the water. All right, he drowned. But they covered him. How did he get covered? Well, they could have had a landslide when he fell off, but, you know, that's even more unusual. What's the problem? See, if he's laying on the bottom, Now, all right, there's two ways we find fossils. We find them all higgledy-piggledy everywhere, or we find them nice lined up where every bone is right in order, just the way it was when they were alive. Higgledy-piggledy, okay. So anyway, his bones, many times we find fossils where they're all lined up, and they're not all scattered. Well, they call this disarticulated. They like big words. Anyway, if he was on the bottom of this waterway here, and he wasn't buried rapidly, little critters that swim in the water would be over there, eating on him and knocking his bones all around, and pretty soon he'd be disarticulated. So we wouldn't find his bones all nice and lined up. So they got to bury him rapidly. How did they do that? They didn't tell us how that happened. I had this find in my yard, and I'm not positive. I think it's a possum because he's disarticulated. He will never turn into a fossil because he's on the surface, and there's no water, and there's no dirt to cover him. So then they say, it wears away over a period of time with erosion, and then we can find the fossil. So they had these three pictures. Now, I was looking at this, and I was thinking, I don't know, they seem like they're grasping at straws a little bit to try to build a fossil. Some was very unusual events. And I wouldn't have thought so much about this, except for I went to another textbook, and they had this series of, that's not the one, this series of pictures. And now this dinosaur, he had his belly ripped open. Must have been in a fight. They didn't finish him because they would have disarticulated his bones all over the place. And he's laying on the shoreline. They had to get him really close to the shore, and they got his head in the water. But then the water rose. Was this high tide? And if it kept coming in, if he's on the beach, that's the worst place to try to make a fossil. There's crabs and all kinds of things out there that'll be messing up your bones. So then they got him buried with dirt. So the actual example they give you wouldn't work. You know why they do this? They don't want you thinking about a flood. Isn't that funny? Well, I've heard people say, all right, yeah, okay, maybe dinosaurs, whatever, but what about carbon dating? Doesn't carbon dating prove that we have really, really, really old fossils? So let's look at carbon-14. Now, this is going to get a little bit technical. I was actually explaining this in one of my first times doing this, and I had a Dr. E. Theo Egard in the audience. And he came up to me afterward, and he said, oh, no, that's not the way it works. And he straightened me out. It was a minor thing, no big deal. Actually, he was one of the scientists who was contributed to the book in 6 days, Why 50 Scientists Choose to Believe in Creation. So I thank you, Dr. Theo Egard, for helping me get this straight. So what we have that happens, first of all, we start with the atmosphere. It's got nitrogen. Nitrogen is atomic weight 14. It's up in the atmosphere, especially the higher atmosphere. And cosmic rays come down, and they strike a neutron. And a neutron runs over and hits the nitrogen 14 and knocks out a proton, and the neutron stays. Well, what that does is it changes it from nitrogen to carbon, but it's still got the weight of 14. So it's called carbon-14. Now, it's a little bit unstable. Now, we have normal carbon would come in carbon-12. Carbon-14, there's also some carbon-13. So if you go out in the world and you test around, you'll have a whole lot of carbon-12 and a little bit of carbon-13 and 14. Now, carbon, we're all carbon-based life forms, at least I hope we all are. And carbon, it mixes with oxygen to make carbon dioxide, and then the plants take in the carbon dioxide. When we eat the plants, we take in some radiation, carbon-14, just a little bit. You don't have to go see a doctor. And when you keep eating it, a certain amount of carbon-14 will stay in your body until you die because you quit eating. Once you quit eating, then the clock starts, and the carbon-14 will get less and less and less. And so they date how much carbon-14 you have to how much carbon-12 you have, and they can come up with a date. Okay, so that's the principle of carbon-14 dating. Now, it's important to know that the ratio of carbon-12 to carbon-14 is about 1 in a trillion. So they have something very small to measure, and it's getting less. Now, carbon-14's half-life is about 5,120 years. So if you figure about 10 half-lives, that would have 1,000th less. So, I don't know, 1,000th of a trillionth. The maximum accuracy you could expect to get out of carbon-14 dating would be 50,000 years. So if anybody tells you they carbon dated something to 1 million years old, I would be a little skeptical about that. Now, this whole carbon dating thing has a couple of assumptions. Important assumptions. You see, if your assumptions are no good, your conclusions are no good. So we got to look at the assumptions in carbon dating. First of all, they want us to, you expect, if you believe in a long age of the Earth, that carbon-14 would be in steady state. Now, to explain that, let's say we start with a pristine Earth. No carbon-14 at all. We got lots of nitrogen, and cosmic rays are striking and making carbon-14. Over a period of time, you'd be getting more and more carbon-14, and at some point it would level off because some of it would be turning back to carbon-12. And at some point you would reach steady state where it wouldn't get any more. Now, if the world is 4.6 billion years old, we should have reached steady state billions of years ago. Well, the problem is we're actually still increasing in carbon-14. With the half-life of 5,120 years, makes you wonder. I think that kind of tells you the Earth is a lot younger. Also, the same amount of carbon-14 is forming today as it was in the past. You see, if the past, the atmosphere was a different composition, or let's say we had this boundary layer of protection around the Earth that protected it from forming carbon-14, and we'll look at that in Paradise Lost, number 6. If there was none forming in the past, and only in the last 4,400 years we've been even forming any, then all your dating would look larger, like long time frames, when there wasn't long time frames. Actually, all the errors of their assumptions stretch the timeline. Now, there's some problems relating to how these different types of carbon-12 and carbon-14 are absorbed in the body, and I'm not going to go into that. But there's also a problem with the environmental factors affecting how carbon-14 survives in the body. Now, they assume a closed system, meaning nothing from the environment affects how the amount of carbon-14 there is in the body or the specimen. But let's read a little statement from someone, a geologist. It said, some geologists question the use of carbon-14 method for samples stored under moist conditions. For this is a most serious limitation for who can be sure that a given sample was not moistened. So the problem they have is if it gets wet, carbon-14 gets drained out of it easier than carbon-12. Uh-oh, our dates are all messed up. I don't know, we started with fossils getting wet. Well, if you have a machine and you want to calibrate it, and you're calibrating it for, let's say, 100,000 years, how do you calibrate that? You got to have something to test it with. Anyway, if you have a tool that you're using to measure something, you need a way of validating the tool. Is it accurate? Does it give you consistent readings? Okay, I'm going to give you an example. Let's say I have a speed gun. I invented it myself. And I'm going to be out there, and I'm going to be a cop, and you're going to be driving by, and I'm going to aim my gun at you, and I point it at, and it says 30. And I reset it, and it says 300. And I reset it, and it says 90. And I pull you over because you're obviously speeding. And I say, how fast were you going? Oh, really? Well, all right, I'm going to give you a ticket for going, 90 miles an hour. Are you going to be happy about that? Now, there's another problem. When you test one part of the body and another part of the same body, you should get the same reading, right? If you have a valid system, it should work the same at both places. If they're going to age things, well, we have this woolly mammoth they found in Fairbanks Creek, and they had a radiocarbon dating of the bone in its leg of 15,000. They checked its skin, and it was 21,000. So that's kind of freaky. His leg was dead for 6,000 years while he was still moving around. I guess he had a serious limp. Now I have to ask you, if you have a mineral replaced fossil, what are you dating? Nothing. It's not there anymore. It's gone. It's been fossilized. All the minerals have been washed away, and all you have is the outline. You can't date a fossil. Okay. Well, I decided I was going to go to a isotope lab to figure out how they do dating, and I was going to get me an entry form. So here I get the form, and I take some of the parts off. I went to the Center for the Applied Isotope Studies at the University of Georgia. And they have this stuff. There's other parts they ask you, but they ask you the sample context. How fast was it going? I mean, how old was your rock? They ask you how old your rock is. I thought they were telling us. You know why they ask us? Because they'll get the 30, the 300, and the 90, and they want to know which reading they get they should say it is. Because they don't get consistent readings. So they ask you how old it is. Now, there's a couple of other isotope methods that they use for dating, and they all have significant problems. I just looked at one of them. They have potassium argon, lead uranium, an lithium. Here's an article from a creationist. An evolutionist wrote this, a very famous evolutionist. An earlier increase in neutrino levels must have had the peculiar characteristic of resetting all our atomic clocks. This would knock our C14, potassium argon, and uranium lead dating measurements into the cocked hat. That means it's all messed up, unreliable, useless. The age of prehistoric artifacts, which we're looking at, the age of the earth, the age of the universe would be thrown into question. Wow. They date the universe by this method? That's how they get the 20 billion or the 13.699 billion years from Wikipedia? And it's in the cocked hat, and that's what they're quoting and making us learn in our schools? Well, I need a field trip. I don't know about y'all. Let's take a field trip. We could go to the museum. Y'all want to go to the museum? Let's go to the museum. We'll go to the School of Mines Museum in Rapid City, South Dakota. We're in this museum, and we're going to have a guided tour. We'll get all the best. Probably have some refreshments later. And the guide says to us, this is a plesiosaur, and this plesiosaur is 70 million years old. So I go, excuse me, sir. How do you know this dinosaur is 70 million years old? And he says, Well, that dinosaur was found in 70-million-year-old rock. Okay. So we see that little panel in the back there, that display. We're going to go over there where they talk about rocks. And he says, this rock layer here is 70 million years old. Excuse me, sir. How do you know that rock is 70 million years old? Well, we found a 70-million-year-old dinosaur in that rock. What you call this is circular reasoning. Actually, the truth be known, their belief in evolution is their proof of evolution. The rocks, the layers, the strata, are dated by the fossils, and then the fossils are dated by the layers. Let's go to a text. Oh, we're going to go to a textbook in a minute. See, what you find if you go out there and look at the rock layers, you'll see limestone, shale, sandstone, limestone conglomerate, sandstone, limestone, shale, limestone. It repeats over and over again, different layer types. So how do you tell the difference between 100-million-year-old Jurassic limestone and 600-million-year-old Cambrian limestone? They're both limestone. In about 1830, Charles Lyell, Paul Deshalles, all these guys, came up with a biostratigraphic technique, the geologic column, for dating Cenozoic deposits based on the relative proportions of living and extinct fossil mollusks. You see, they believed the fossil mollusks that were extinct had to be much older than the fossil mollusks that were not extinct. So their belief in evolution was their method of laying out the dates of the layers. Strangely, little effort has been made to test this assumption. This failure leaves the method vulnerable to circularity. Here's a textbook used to teach your children and perhaps you. In page 306, it says, the layers of rock can be dated by the types of fossils they contain. That's dating the rocks by the fossils. Then we flip the page over to 307. It says, scientists have determined, scientists are smart, right? They've determined it. The relative times from the locations of the fossils in the sedimentary rock layers. They're dating the fossils by the rocks. They date the rocks by the fossils, and they date the fossils by the rocks. Ever since William Smith at the beginning of the 19th century, fossils have been and still are the best and most accurate method of dating and correlating the rocks in which they occur. This is the best way they get. Not the carbon dating. Their best and most accurate method is their belief in evolution. They also have a thing called index fossils. Basically, in the early 1800s, what they did is they made a chart. And they put different fossils in different places. And they said, okay, we'll call this time frame Jurassic. And we'll give it an age, I don't know, 150 million years. They make it up. And then they say, okay, whenever we find this index fossil, and it comes from that layer and that age. So the idea is the index fossil tells you the age. So let's look at some of the index fossils that help us keep these layers in order. First, we have the trilobite. Trilobite fossils make good index fossils. If a trilobite such as this was found in a rock layer, the rock layer probably was formed 500 to 600 million years ago. I love these huge numbers. Well, whoops. Here's a footprint stepping on a trilobite. It's in a shoe. It's a shoe. Stepping on a trilobite. Now, this is in the Cambrian layer. It's supposed to be 425 million years old. And we got a human footprint, human shoe print, stepping on a trilobite. I'd say that's a problem for evolution. Because man, it's like, a lot more close to now. Well, there's a bunch of places where we found human footprints. It's not a rare occurrence. So, I mean, if you really were looking to find the evidence, it's plentiful. If you look in the various rock layers, human evidence is all over the whole thing. We have skulls, footprints. There's metallic items that they've made. It's all the way back to the Cambrian layer, which was supposed to be like the oldest thing. A graptolite is an index fossil, and it's a fossilized plant of some sort. And when you see a graptolite, it's supposed to be 410 million years old. Well, there's a problem. They're still alive in South Pacific today. All right, so if they're alive today, which layers could you find them in? All of them? Any of them? Now, right at this part in the chart, there's a 325 million index fossil called the lobe-finned fish. Now, these fish are famous because they're talking about they're being the first ones to kind of help try to walk out of the water. You know, they're starting to get bones in their fins, lobe fins. Well, these really old fish are still alive. So, if the lobe-finned fish is still alive today, what layer could we find them in? Any, every, all those allness words. Well, it actually gets worse for the evolutionists. I almost feel sorry for them. You know, there's a guy, he was looking at a dinosaur bone under a microscope, and he found blood inside the bone. Well, this is supposed to be 65 million years old, and it still has blood in it? What? I don't know. They found soft body tissue. See, in the past, they didn't even look. They knew it couldn't be there. They were lucky to find bones. A dinosaur heart and other soft body organs were found. In 2003, they found a T-Rex soft tissue. They even started decoding the genetic material from a T-Rex. Yeah, I'm afraid they're going to make a few of them. That's 68 million years old for a Tyrannosaurus Rex. You know, it used to be thought impossible. That's funny. Why did they think it was impossible and now they think it's possible? Because they had to find some. When we found them. It reminds me of Lewis Carroll in The Red Queen. She says, why, sometimes I believe as many as 6 impossible things before breakfast. You know, impossible. I don't know if you know the meaning of that word there, you know. So, fossils, crystals, coal, oil, flowstone, sedimentary rock, petrified wood. How long does it actually take these to form? Because if it takes a million years to form oil, like this one Sinclair sign seems to say, it says, mellowed for 100 million years. They're oil. So, how long does it take this stuff to form? Well, let's go look. Let's look at, first of all, flowstone. Flowstone is really, I don't know, if you've been in a cave, they have stalactites and stalagmites. And they'll tell you they take millions of years to form these things. Don't touch them. Well, there was a guy in Wyoming in 1903, and he had a little artesian well bubbling up in his yard, and he decided to stick a pipe in it, and it would bubble out the top. So in 1903, he did that, and 90 years later, we've got that. In 90 years, we formed lots of flowstone, and it's actually bigger than that now. It's a tourist attraction, and they sell tickets to come in and look at the big flowstone. Here we have a bat. Before he rotted, he got covered in flowstone. Guess you can get the idea why it's called flowstone. All right, crystals. How long does it take to form crystals? They tell you a diamond was formed under lots of heat and pressure over millions of years. Except we're forming them rapidly in laboratories. Real diamonds. You look at the synthetic diamond versus the natural diamond. It has the exact same refractive index, same dispersion, same hardness, same density. They actually make them, inscribe them with a laser fake. Maybe not the word fake, but to let them know it's man-made so that they can tell the difference between the man-made diamonds and the ones they find in the field. I wouldn't put my money in diamonds. Anything they can print. So how long does it take fossils to form? Surely it takes a long time to form a fossil. Well, here's a boot with a fossilized leg in it. The boot didn't fossilize, but the leg did. Now, the boot company said that those were made in the early 50s, those boots, and they found it in a dry creek bed in the West Texas town of Ira Ann in 1980. So that's 30 years. Get that fossil leg. There's a fossilized hat, fossilized pickle, teddy bear. Now, they did this fossilizing in 4 months. Now, there was an event that happened in the world that also gives us some good evidence about how things can form rapidly in about 1980. And that was an event in Washington State called Mount St. Helens. And it has done a lot to rewrite our textbooks, if they would rewrite textbooks. It was equivalent to 20 million tons of TNT, and it had ash and debris that came roaring down the mountain. It was 600 degrees and going 200 miles an hour. So I could just see me, I've got my Lamborghini, and I'm riding down the mountain at 160 miles an hour, and it still gets you. I don't have a Lamborghini. So the explosion happened in 1980 in May. There was one for 9 hours. There was another one in June, and then another one 2 years later. Now, when Mount St. Helens was about to go, there was a lot of tremors, and there was a lot of warning. And they told people to get off the mountain, it's going to go. And there was a guy named Harry Truman. He didn't listen to the warnings. Harry just stayed there in his cabin. Don't worry about me. He's still there. Now, there's warnings going out to people today that things are about to come to an end. And a lot of them aren't listening. Well, here's the day of the eruption. It's looking a little puffy. Well, it blew out the side, and that kind of uncorked it. And right about here, the cameraman's a little nervous. Well, they always send people out with orange suits and waving things in the air. That's some kind of ritual, I don't know. If we dig them up later, we'll probably say it was a religious event. Here we have a lot of dust. They're probably checking out, make sure nobody's in that truck. And lots of ash all over the place. As a matter of fact, it spread over a good portion of the northwestern part of the country. The yellow zone is traced to ½ an inch. And I guess with wind currents, a bit of that landed in Oklahoma. Now, Mount St. Helens is actually a fairly small volcano. It, in this scale here, it's showing that Mount St. Helens is 1 cubic kilometer of material came out. Like Mount Vesuvius had 3 times as much. And that happened in 79 AD. And I believe the army that destroyed Jerusalem in 70 AD was at this location and was wiped out by Vesuvius. How interesting. Pompeii. Krakatoa was 18 times larger, and they called that the volcano that was heard round the world. The sound from that traveled thousands and thousands of miles. Tambora, even earlier, was 80 times larger than Mount St. Helens. So I'm giving you the idea that if you have a lot of big volcanoes going on, there's much larger scale of what we're going to show you. So here is after the explosion, things settled down. Now in front, you can kind of see the trace there. The Toutle River ran by Mount St. Helens. And when all this debris came down, it blocked the river. And the river, over a period of time, was building up. It's got to go somewhere. And it very slowly came over and started cutting a channel. And then as it started cutting the channel in these soft sediments, it started cutting very rapidly. And then a torrent came down. And this canyon you see here was formed rapidly. It's 1,000 feet wide and 140 feet deep, and it was formed in minutes. Now there's some other interesting aspects of this canyon that are similar to like the Grand Canyon, but on a smaller scale. What you could see is these very small stratifications on the walls. You see how those lines, very thin lines, they're actually millimeter-sized layers that were formed there. And these were all formed horizontally and simultaneously. All the layers at once. Now the logs got tossed some of these trucks around like Tonka toys. There was a lot of force involved here. They stripped the trees bare of all their foliage and branches. Most of them got knocked over. And you have to remember, there was lots of dust, and it's in the pyroclastic flow, and lots of heat. I don't know if you have worked with heat-treated lumber. It's very hard. But they also embedded extremely these logs with lots of dust, like pressure forced into the logs. Well, somebody had the brilliant idea. A logger says, hey, look at all that wood laying out there. Let's go cut some lumber. So they hauled some back to the lumber mill, and it was too hard to cut. It's well on its way to being fossilized. Here we have logs floating on Spirit Lake, and there's some that have log has sunk. Actually, these are on their way to, depending on the circumstances, you could make coal out of these, but they didn't form coal yet. Now I want to notice some of these logs floating in different ways, because we're going to see something later that looks similar to this. But at Mount St. Helens, what they did is they went up to the dome area and they took samples from 5 locations. And they subjected them to potassium-argon testing. And the potassium-argon test said that those rocks that they found up there were 500,000 to 3 million years old. The actual age was 11 years. No wonder they talk in millions of years. So what we find at Mount St. Helens, we found that age testing doesn't work. Excuse me. We found nearly petrified trees. We found layers formed rapidly that were millimeter-sized layers. And we found some similarities, like the sharpness of the canyon, of Grand Canyon. So if you look at Grand Canyon, you could see it's very sharp edges. It's not softly rounded edges that erosion over a long period of time. Actually, there's a funny thing about that river. I don't know, you have the river here, then you have this hill next to it, and the river cut through the hill. So did it go over the hill and then cut it? You know, I mean, you don't go uphill. Actually, there's some very large canyons in America that have no river at all. None. They're just a big canyon. Now, if all this dirt got dug out of the Grand Canyon by this river over a long period of time, you'd expect to find a big delta at the end. You know, where'd the dirt go? There's a little bitty delta at the end of the Colorado River. Now, there's a really a guy that's been studying this quite a lot, and he believes that there was a lake above the Grand Canyon. He's called it Grand Lake, and he can find the parts of the hills that got broken away that are above the Grand Canyon, and it washed through there rapidly, and it spread the dirt all over the southwest of the United States. So that's where the dirt went, rapidly. I went there, and I found the canyon didn't look that big, and the people looked really small. So here we have, I want to again point it to the things floating in the lake. And all the leaves stripped off, and some are floating upside down, some right side up. There's some trees floating in rock. How did they get there? So what these are called are polystrate trees. Some are upside down, extending through many layers. Okay, now, if the tree was standing there, how long could it be that tree would keep standing there while those layers stacked up? Not very long. Isn't the tree going to rot and fall off? I mean, trees don't grow through rock. So that means all those layers were put down at the same time the trees were put down. So the layers didn't mean lots of time. Now, they find this all over the place. They find it in Germany, France, Great Britain, Nova Scotia, California, some of the eastern states. This one here is 25 feet through layers of rock. It actually would have been longer, but the bottom part broke off. Which proves those layers were contemporaneous with the log. Now, when I was in school, they taught me about rocks. And they taught me that there was 3 kinds of rocks. Oh yeah, there's sedimentary rocks, there's igneous rocks, and metamorphic rocks. And it kind of goes from one to the next. You know, you can have a metamorphic rock and it wear away and feeds to build up a sedimentary rock. And sedimentary rock can get burnt up by some igneous, some hot stuff and turn into a metamorphic rock, and et cetera. So, you know, they talk about all these rock types. So there's 3 types. Except, I think there's a 4th kind. And I found this from Dr. Robert Gentry. He's a scientist from the Oak Ridge National Laboratory, and he was studying polonium halos in granite and coalified wood. Now, there's a couple of different isotopes of polonium. One of the isotopes has a half-life of 0.016 seconds. That's faster than you can snap your finger. Now, how he found these fingerprints, I'll call them fingerprints of God, in granites, the basement rocks of the world. Now, what happens when this radioactive particle decays? It puts out little damage zones in a sphere around the particle. And if you cut them in half, they look like circles. Well, based on how far out the damage zone is, they can tell you which isotope it is. And so they found these isotopes of this polonium that has a really fast half-life in granite. Now, we were told that granite was formed by being molten first and then solid. Except if it's molten, the damage zones, these little circles, the spheres inside the rocks, would get washed away. They had to be solidified instantaneously. God spoke, and it stood fast. So this fourth kind of rock, the finder, Robert Gentry, he named them Genesis rocks. I don't know. I like to come up with names too. I said Logosic, the word made rock. Anyway, next session, I'm going to look at dinosaurs. When did dinosaurs live? Man with dinosaurs? Dinosaurs in history? Dinosaurs in the Bible? Are dinosaurs amalgamations? Are there still dinosaurs alive today? Heavenly Father, we thank you for creating this world by just speaking. Your power is wonderful and great, but your love is greater. We look to you for all of our strength as we walk through the day. In Yeshua.